Violence is almost never justified.
But sometimes violence is the only way.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here is your host and moderator.
Welcome, viewers. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation today. My name is Andrea Luxton. I am the president of Andrews University in Michigan, and I am today's moderator. And I would like you now to meet our other panelists for today.
Hi, I'm Tom Plumley. I'm the senior minister at First Christian Church, Fort Worth, Texas.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Dan Levin. I serve as senior rabbi at Temple Bethel in Boca Raton, Florida.
Hi, I'm Carl Troval. I'm professor of ethics and history at Concordia University in Austin, Texas.
Hi, I'm Tony Matthews, and I'm the senior pastor at North Garland Baptist Fellowship in Garland, Texas.
Thank you all very much. And now to today's topic. The results of a January 2022 poll organized by CBC suggest that tolerance for violence over key government issues has increased in the United States. Of those polled, 35%, 29%, 28%, and 27% respectively agreed violence might be justified in response to issues of civil rights, gun policies, election results, and labor issues. In that same poll, 62% of those polled anticipated violence in future elections from those who lost, and 66% felt that democracy is currently at risk in this nation. Some of those in favor of violence will argue that that is the only way to put right something that is wrong. Others who are opposed to using violence respond that violence forces a personal agenda on another and has little to do with right or wrong. On the surface, it seems that politics, more than religious and faith convictions, decides where an individual stands on the questions of when violence is justified. Yet there are times when the nation has responded with violence to respond to national or global threats. Violence, for example, became part of the important journey to end slavery. Some would argue, however, that these national and corporate decisions to use violence are more right than a personal decision. With these opinions in mind, the panelists are asked to consider at least three questions. Firstly, when, if ever, is violence justified? Secondly, how does the Bible or Torah impact your understanding of the appropriate use of violence? And finally, is the choice of a nation to use violence for a cause a more righteous cause than the choice of an individual? We're going to start today's conversation by turning to those who began our program today.
Thank you. I want to begin very humbly. This is a difficult subject. We can talk about just war theory. We can talk about all sorts of things about the ethics of how you prosecute a war or what you do, what is necessary for one ethically to be responsible in resorting to violence. I usually come out on this panel as something of a pacifist. I am not a total pacifist. My problem is that I just feel that we have a tendency to justify the use of violence way too frequently. And that's our problem. in his candidacy for president back in 1964, Barry Goldwater said, "Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice." And when he said those words, he meant extremism against the New Deal from the 30s and 40s, from FDR. He meant extremism in defense of the status quo in relationship to the civil rights movement of his day. And he meant the nuclear option in regard to the threat of communism and the Soviet Union in particular. But today, as I think the moderator's statement stated pretty clearly, we are in a place where more and more people would agree with Barry Goldwater, of all people. And today, I think that they say things like that if the issue is abortion, or in the context of cultural pluralism and us having too many folk around who aren't, who don't look like us, or in the context of the loss of power by people like me, straight, white, Protestant males. I think we're at a difficult time and a turning point where we need to stand up as people of faith and say that this is not the time for violence, and to talk about, yes, there might be times when violence is necessary, only fuels the fire, only stokes the claims of those who, for instance, on January 6, 2021, attacked the Capitol of the United States in an effort to overturn the results of an election. That sort of risk is what we're running when we begin to talk about the justification for the use of violence. And again, let me close where I began. It is simply too easy, and we do it too frequently, in justifying the use of violence when there are plenty of other ways to deal with our problems and our disagreements.
So, thank you, Tom. I think that when we look in Scripture, in the Torah, there is a concept called a milchemet mitzvah, which means a war of obligation. And a war of obligation in the biblical context was either the war to secure the Israelites' claim in their homeland, but also it was to repel aggression and to defend oneself. The law again and again says that if you are under attack, it is your obligation to defend yourself. And at the same time, I have always been so enamored with the ideas of Gandhi and Satyagraha, the idea of nonviolent protest, because Gandhi taught an essential truth, which is if you ever really want to figure out the moral truth of a subject, violence will only cloud that vision. That the moral clarity of a question can only be discerned through nonviolence. And that's how he was able to find liberation for people of India. But there was a very famous debate between Gandhi and the German philosopher Martin Buber as to, well, would nonviolence have worked against Hitler? And Gandhi said, even against Hitler, you should have exercised nonviolence. And Martin Buber said, yeah, no. That there are certain times when the evil that manifests itself has to be repelled. So when we think about when is violence allowed for, and I agree with you, Tom, that it should be far more infrequent than it often is. It is when you have a defensive posture, not an aggressive posture. You can't manifest violence because you have a truth and you need to put it out there and enforce it. It's because you are under assault and you need to defend and repel the aggression against that assault, whether it's to protect the weak or the oppressed, or I'm thinking of when the Israeli military went and rescued the hostages in Entebbe. There are times when you have to apply force to ensure that justice is served.
Thank you. Carl.
Well, I appreciate both of what you said. You said you didn't want to get into just war, and here I'm actually going to go run through them just so that people have a sense of what it is. In the Christian tradition, Christianity started out as a pacifist movement, really because Jesus turned the other cheek, and mostly because they were a minority religion and had no power, and then were being executed as well, persecuted by the Romans. But when they gained power after Constantine and then were responsible politically for their citizens, the whole church kind of began to rethink, with the help of Augustine and then later Thomas Aquinas, the tradition of just war, which is what we've adopted in many ways in the West. And under that tradition, there is a strong presumption against using violence to solve problems for precisely the reason you mentioned, Dan. But before you begin violence, there were things that you had to click through and think about. Is it a just cause? Self-defense is primarily the just cause where it's allowable. I mean, wars of aggression, certainly not. But you also have to have a right intent. That is, you have to have a willingness to establish a just peace, one that's rich in justice. Third, it should be given by a legitimate authority. It can't just be anybody giving orders. It has to be the last resort. In other words, you have to have tried every possible way to solve the problem nonviolently before you use violence. There should be a clear declaration of what your purposes are in using warfare or this violence. Six, there should be a reasonable chance of success, because to use violence when you can't possibly win would be stupid and would be destructive. And finally, the proportionality. You should be gaining far more than what it's going to cost. Of course, I mean, the myth of it is that you have the ability to actually calculate that. Most wars get easily out of hand, and then we're in trouble. But I think that those kinds of principles are really very helpful in thinking about violence and when it's possible. There's been a really strong tradition about using these as ways to evaluate when one would use violence or not. And I see nothing in the United States that would even justify the beginning of that kind of violence, unless it was a kind of defense of the Constitution, perhaps, or someone's usurping and trying to take the country over. Maybe then you would use violence. But well, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I have a question. In the statement, it says violence might be justified in response to issues of gun policies. What is meant by that? Is that?
Yeah, I think the poll that was referred to in the statement, there were the four elements: civil rights. Would you use force against civil rights? Would you use force because you didn't agree with gun policies? In other words, if there were more gun restrictions, would you feel you could use violence to stop those policies?
To stop those, okay.
If you feel like somebody's going to come take your guns,
Yeah.
Yes.
you can use them, by golly.
Gotcha. Okay. I grapple with, it's a great topic, I love it. In addition, I grapple with, I think it's semantics for me, the use of force versus the use of violence. Violence is like, it's an intentional act, as I understand it, an intentional act of physical force to hurt, damage, kill something or someone. And I think we see so much violence in the country that we certainly, don't want that. But I agree with what Dan has mentioned, and I believe Carl, is that there's just causes. There are times when protecting yourself is important and certainly validated. Self-defense. How do we handle the death penalty? Some would call that, violence. But as a proponent of the death penalty, is that something that is, seen as a violent act that should not be? Jesus did tell us to turn the other cheek. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And in the Beatitudes, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called the children of God." So I think we have to kind of balance being peacemakers and seeking peace, modeling peace, teaching it, preaching it. And I think at the same time, we have to be ready to defend ourselves. And because I think that is just, and I think it's wise. And so I just kind of grapple with, I think it's a great topic. But I think overall, the Lord wants us to live in a peaceful context. But, that's ideal. But the real reality is there are times when we have to have wars, and there's a time when we have to defend ourselves, and people have to be checked, if you will, and put in their place. And sometimes that takes force. And that's where I am on the topic.
But I don't see. I don't want us to have an academic argument here. I agree with everything each of you has said, but I don't want this to be an academic argument. I see us in a context right now where too many people are trying to find justifications to use violence to get their way. And the American system is built on doing just the opposite. The American system is built on providing alternatives, conflict resolution, majority rule, but minority having a strong voice in all sorts of contexts. The protection of voting rights, the ability of each of us to have a voice, to elect leaders and to recall leaders. All of those things are built into our system to allow us to make corrections that we need, that we feel need to be made. If we can't win the day, there are too many people who are saying now, I can't get my way in those ways, therefore I'm going to resort to violence.
I'm sorry. I think the thing that you're talking about, though, Tom, which is when someone says, I'm going to employ violence in an extrajudicial fashion. And I think that what our society what has been the crowning jewel of our society is the preeminence of the rule of law. And if you look at the end of World War II, which arguably was one of the most, if not the most violent act in humankind's history, what did they do at the end was they reestablished the rule of law. They established the Nuremberg trials to say the way that we're going to reclaim our humanity is not to meet violence with violence. We did that already. We had to win the war. But now that we've won the war, to secure the peace, we're going to reestablish the rule of law as supreme. And it was that reestablishment of the rule of law that I think not only helped redeem us from that horrible conflict, but is kind of like what you're talking about. It's when people want to employ violence when they, in an extrajudicial fashion, rather than subservience to the rule of law, that's when society gets to be in a very dangerous place.
And that's when violence is not appropriate.
Yep.
And I hear this argument a lot. The January 6th incident will come up and the violence there. And then people will say, well, when it comes to the riots that we saw over, the unfortunate incident of George Floyd and some of the burning down of buildings, that these people get a pass. And so I think consistency Yeah, no one on this panel, but that's just the conversation that is out there in different spaces, is that one of the problems is we don't see the consistency. One group will be condemned for violence, and then the other group gets a pass when they're burning down buildings. And
Well, and they didn't get a pass. And
And we must have a pause. Thank you. Let's have a
We hope you're enjoying today's program. If you'd like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the vision and history of the program, and we invite you to become a ministry partner, explore our Town Hall Estates healthcare facilities, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, we look forward to receiving your letters. You may write us at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. If you have a prayer request, please send it to prayerrequest@americanreligious.org. Thank you for writing and thank you for watching. Now, back to today's closing statements.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying today's program. It's certainly one that is very relevant to the lives we're all leading right now. And I would like the panelists now to share their summation.
yes, violence is sometimes justified. But the problem is that the context in which we find ourselves right now is one in which it's one where issues internal to the United States are being raised to the level where people say that violence is necessary to make the change that they feel is necessary. That is anathema to our system. Our system was created with all sorts of checks and balances to allow other ways to make those changes that you deem necessary.
I'm in a pickle over here because I completely agree with you, because it is within legitimate authority. You're looking for legitimate authority. No one can just rebel. And yet I was thinking about the establishment of the United States of America. I mean, when I evaluate the criteria of our own rebellion against England, I don't think that was a just war. I think our whole establishment of our government was dare I say, I think it might have been an immoral act, at least according to the Christian tradition and the criteria of just war.
You mean you still be part of England then?
Yeah. I mean, Canada seems to be doing fine. In Australia, right? Obviously, I'm playing here, but I mean, here's the weird thing is that, we talk about this rebellion, but I struggle with it because I don't think that our original rebellion against England was necessarily justified according to the principles that I just laid down.
yeah, it's interesting conversation. Again, consistency is important for me, and then the national versus the individual responsibilities. From an individual perspective, I think we all, as people of God, we should do everything we can to be peacemakers and to spread peace, spread love. At the same time, I think it's wise for us to protect ourselves as well. And from a national perspective, there are times when we have to inflict some punishment for the greater good, in particular if we're protecting lives and freedoms and things that are dear to our hearts.
I think in my tradition, law is sacred. It is, in Hebrew, halakha, which is Jewish law, literally means the holy path. It's the path that you follow. It's the way that you walk, living a righteous life. In social contract theory, Thomas Hobbes described that state of nature when there was no such thing as law, right, as nasty, brutish, and short. And so we created a contract with each other that says, listen, we'll live by the same agreed upon rules so that our safety, our personhood will be protected from violence. And so when people evade or supersede their own judgment for that of the rule of law, we, I think, find ourselves moving into a pretty dangerous place. And that's where I think Gandhi was speaking so eloquently about the need for nonviolent protest, because if the law is unjust, the only way I'm going to be able to prove that that law is unjust is through nonviolent protest. So we could have an interesting debate, perhaps, Carl, in a future program about the ethical justification for the revolution in the United States. But I would say that, right, the idea of one's right to self-determination, the Indians, who are no longer part of that British Empire, proved is a moral right that should be given to people, and if not given, should be secured for people. As we tape this episode, there are over 100,000 Russian troops perched on the border of a sovereign state of Ukraine. For no justified reason, they should be able to employ whatever force necessary to repel that aggression. These kinds of conflicts, these kinds of extrajudicial things, these ways in which we deny human beings their own inalienable rights, I think is where violence needs to be used only to protect, not to assault.
Thank you all very much. And viewers, as you have heard today, I think pretty much everyone is really saying the same thing. There are times when, yes, violence, or if you want to call it force, is justified. But when it becomes that personal desire for what I want, then that becomes a whole different type of thing. And I think we're also agreeing that there's just a little bit too much of that around right now. And that makes the whole feeling of a culture different. It adds a level of intimidation and a level of fear that whoever is the strongest gets what they want, rather than whatever is right is what is done. And that provides us, I think, as a nation, a challenging dilemma. Well, viewers, I do hope that when you listen to us, you are jotting down ideas, things you might want to share with us. We are always open to your comments, your thoughts. Please let us know if we can help you and support you through prayer in any way. We are here. We want you to feel part of this community at the American Religious Town Hall. The Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestant, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And so now, friends, until next week at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.